Hi guys, I'm Michael Spicer, software engineer here at BBD. I've been doing software development for about 5 or 6 years now, and despite that, I still many days feel like a junior. And that's the central point of today's presentation. I'm going to start off with an example rather than the topic. Early on in my career, I had a very interesting experience. I was part of a team of incredibly experienced software developers with literal decades in the industry, and we had all sat down to try and decide on a new feature we were going to implement. As with many of these meetings, there were a lot of different approaches to it, and 2 distinct factions emerged throughout it, each with rather different approaches. And throughout this, their opinions clashed with one another, each side vying to try and justify their opinion, prove to one another that their approach was the best. I sat there, true junior developer, really confused by all the language, all the words being thrown around, design patterns I didn't recognize. I distinctly remember thinking that I had to remind myself I was capable of speaking the English language with all these new words and things being thrown at me. At some point, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the lead engineer turned to me and everyone went silent. All eyes were on me. And he said, "You've been surprisingly quiet. What do you think?" I vividly recall the thought that ran through my head at that time. Oh God, he's going to discover that I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm sure many of you have experienced this exact same thing before. This is a common phenomenon called imposter syndrome, and it's the topic of our discussion today. Now, this is something that plagues the professional world, and it's that feeling that you don't belong, that you've somehow bamboozled your way into the situation, that any moment somebody's going to rip your mask off and reveal you like some Scooby-Doo villain for the imposter that you actually are. And we're going to explore that idea today, specifically imposter syndrome in tech. Now, while I said this phenomenon is not independent to technology alone, it does cross boundaries. Imposter syndrome in tech has a very unique form in that the industry itself somewhat promotes it. We're going to do a little bit of an exploration of language over here, and you're going to see that simply engaging with the language itself requires a very strong base understanding of the actual vocabulary, but also a pretty strong theoretical understanding of the concepts. Let's have a look at a couple of examples which I feel quite well illustrate this. Let's look at our very first quote over here. You need to consume a JSON API from the back end, then deserialize it into the appropriate class. Not too bad. I'm sure many of you will completely understand what that means. In fact, this might be common parlance in your everyday usage. But for somebody who doesn't know any technical terms whatsoever, this is going to be very inaccessible. It might even look suspicious. Who's Jason? Why are you talking about his back end? Might be best left unexplored. This is just the start of our descent into some of the technical jargon that we're talking about. Let's ramp up the difficulty just a little bit more. Let's have a look at our next phrase over here. If you value idempotence in your code, then functional purity is the only reliable methodology. Now, I had this very colorful phrase thrown at me by a friend and a peer when I was attempting to learn functional programming. Initially, I thought he had actually made a mistake, that he had confused one word for another, and I went searching furiously on Google afterwards to try and find out what he was talking about, and discovered that actually, yes, those are English words with actual meaning. After a long time spent studying it, I eventually managed to find out what that means. And this is one of the guiding principles of functional language. But let's not go too much into that. Instead, let's just keep going further into this labyrinth of confusing technical jargon. Let's have a look at this next one. A monad is a monoid in the category of endofunctors. Now, I discovered this in my attempts to learn Haskell. Now, those of you who've attempted to learn Haskell will know the unique madness that language presents. I'm not entirely convinced sane people attempt to learn Haskell, but it's a very good example of how the language itself can be actively hostile in attempting to understand what's going on. Subsequently, I actually ended up watching multiple lectures, reading multiple papers, trying to figure out what this phrase meant, and I'd be lying if I said I actually understood what it was talking about. Now, these examples are, while these examples are isolated specifically to software development, they represent the unique brand of insanity that is functional programming. The difficulty and technical aspects of language are incredibly common to technology as a whole. These, in fact, are iconic of the difficulty that permeates the whole industry. In order to simply engage with the work, you need a thorough understanding of not only the language that's necessary. If you don't understand the vocabulary, you're not going to understand the sentence, but you need to have an understanding of the theory underpinning that. Add on to that, you need to have a keen awareness of design patterns. You need to know that every single tech stack is constantly evolving and changing. You need to keep up with the industry as it shifts underneath your feet, might be while you're in production. This creates a breeding ground for imposter syndrome. According to a study from the Journal of Behavioral Science, up to 60% of employees in tech feel some form of imposter syndrome. Now that might seem like a high number, but it becomes even more high when you start looking at marginalized or underrepresented groups, pushing that number up to an absolutely astonishing 80% of employees. This is not an uncommon phenomenon, clearly, and this gives us the first stage that we need to try and combat it and understand imposter syndrome. Now, if you are suffering from it yourself, you might be asking, what can I as an individual do to try and combat imposter syndrome? And that's part of why we're here today, is to discuss that very thing. The very first step is, it might seem like a little bit of a cop-out, but it is one of the most common steps in almost every kind of disorder or difficulty that we face in life, and it has to do with acknowledging the problem. Now, in this specific example, I don't mean just admitting that you're suffering from imposter syndrome. I mean a true acknowledgement of not just your own condition of it, but what the actual problem is. As I illustrated earlier, this is a very well-studied and very common phenomenon that is endemic in the industry. And it is vitally important that we realize that feelings of imposter syndrome are not a personal failing. It is not a reflection of your inadequacies, your lack of technical skills, but rather a very common phenomenon that is experienced. Acknowledge that this is not your fault, and you've got a good foundation to start working towards combating it. The next thing we can do, it might also seem like an obvious answer, but there's a little bit of a contradiction involved in it. We need, unfortunately, to discuss imposter syndrome. The difficulty here is that imposter syndrome itself kind of pigeonholes us into not wanting to talk about it. The very act of revealing yourself as an imposter is the thing we're trying to avoid. So it actively disencourages us from opening up and revealing this to other people. Add to that cultural expectations and more often than not a professional environment which encourages excellence and professionalism, where merely revealing that you are not a consummate professional might be seen as a disadvantage, and you have a really, really tough environment that creates imposter syndrome and makes it very hard to deal with. But it is not impossible, and my own personal experiences reflect this. Early on in my career, before I even had this meeting, I recall a coworker who was the consummate professional. She had multiple decades in the industry, profession beyond my years. She had forgotten more about the industry than I have ever known. She was very much a role model for me in terms of professionalism. I looked up to her work. She would often give me good advice, push me in the right direction, if not outright helping me solve a problem. One day when I was struggling with a particularly difficult solution, she noticed that I was under the weather and approached me and asked me, "What's wrong? Is there something I could do to help?" And it was the very first time that I revealed to another person that I was suffering from imposter syndrome. What followed was a really enlightening experience. She told me that in all of her years, multiple decades, she still at times felt like an imposter. This was somebody who was, as I said, my role model. And she too felt this way, despite her excellence. This was a little bit encouraging for me because it actively got me talking to some other peers, some other mentors of mine, some of my subordinates, and I discovered that this is incredibly common. It actually started my journey in an attempt to combat imposter phenomenon. And in my research, I discovered two very, very good examples which best illustrate that imposter syndrome is not a personal failing, but merely a phenomenon that just occurs. We're going to look at two individuals. Firstly, acclaimed author, civil rights activist, and poet Maya Angelou, famous author of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I strongly recommend you check out her work if you haven't. She's known as saying, and I quote, "I have written 11 books, but each time I think, they're going to find me out now. I've run a game on everybody, and they're going to find me out." Renowned scientist Albert Einstein once said of his own legacy, "The exaggerated esteem in which my life work is held makes me feel very ill at ease. I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler." Einstein himself, Albert Einstein, described himself as a swindler. If that isn't encouragement, if these two legendary figures, the very apex of their respective fields, felt like imposters, if that doesn't encourage you that this is not a personal failing, I don't really know what will. For me, however, this slow realization that this is a common experience really helped me to normalize and acknowledge these feelings. It helped me change my perspective on it, and it helped me take some of the next steps in an attempt to combat it. The next thing that we can do, obviously, is be aware of the problem, but discuss it. That might seem a little bit trivial, but in discussing it, as we discussed earlier, you will start cultivating a sense of appreciation for your own accomplishments. I want to draw particular emphasis to the word cultivate because it's not as straightforward as it seems, nor is it as easy as you might be hoping. Like a garden, cultivation takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of patience. If any of you have ever attempted to grow a garden before, you know that it's a very difficult process. Plants can be very fickle. They require water every day. Sometimes they might just die randomly. Much like cultivating a garden, imposter syndrome is an ongoing cultivation of ideas. You need to constantly provide it with attention, love, and care, and appreciate the slow growths. Over time, that cultivation will yield results, but it must come with time. It is essential that we acknowledge this is not quickly. If you can do that, though, you can start looking back and appreciating your own successes. One of the downsides of imposter syndrome is that we tend to write off our successes as almost accidental, like we stumbled upon them, bamboozled our way in. Somehow our own skills weren't responsible for it. And a cultivation of appreciation can help overcome that. I strongly recommend that we start looking back on our accomplishments with positivity rather than the negativity that comes with imposter syndrome. Another way to combat this comes from an external source: peers, mentors, people who inspire you. In this industry, many of you will find situations where you have subordinates, people who work beneath you, people who will look up to you as a role model. This is quite a difficult burden to bear, but it's also very important. And it's essential that you acknowledge, if you have subordinates, that you are in a position to help assist them, to help people feel better about their own accomplishments. Studies have actively shown that mentors who take an active role in uplifting their subordinates really helps to combat a sense of imposter syndrome. It's important to remember that we will fail sometimes in our professional world. We will make mistakes. A good mentor will look at those mistakes, and they won't just point out the negative. They won't say, "You've failed, you haven't succeeded." Instead, a good mentor will help uplift the positive while pointing out the critiques. It's not to say that there are no critiques to be had, but rather to emphasize that there is success along with failure, that they exist in codependence with one another. It's important to remember that despite our sincere effort, missteps are not pitfalls, they're not personal failings revealing our incompetence to the people above us, but rather they're opportunities for self-reflection, for learning and improvement. Opportunities to combat imposter syndrome. There's also an unexpected advantage that can come with imposter syndrome. Now, this might seem a little bit counterintuitive. I realize I've spent the last few minutes bemoaning imposter syndrome and talking about ways to fight it off, to stave off these feelings. But strangely enough, especially in our industry, in fact, uniquely in our industry, imposter syndrome can actually be weaponized. It can be a huge source of assistance. Many of you will be aware, technology is ever-changing, constantly mutating and evolving around us. Technology moves lightning quickly, too quickly for many of us. I know I myself struggle to keep pace with the language that I work in every day. It gets a revision every single year. I have to study it. It is actively impossible to stick, maybe not impossible, but it's very difficult to stick to one tech stack or one piece of technology your entire life, unless you happen to be one of those COBOL programmers who've ingrained themselves in a tech stack and are never coming out. For most of us, We're going to be constantly evolving and changing the way we approach our professional jobs. Imposter syndrome, strangely enough, is very effective at keeping you on your toes. Those feelings of insecurity and doubt you might have about your own abilities, your own implementation of the actual code itself, well, use those feelings of imposterism to drive excellence. If you feel like you're not doing a good enough job, go out there, learn, study, practice, do what you can to stay abreast of all of the new technological developments, create projects, work, improve, refactor your own code. Imposter syndrome, when seen through this lens, is less of a hindrance and actually more like a belligerent friend who's trying to offer you sincere advice but doesn't quite know the words to articulate it. I've found that it has actually driven a lot of excellence in my own code. I still have a lot of room to improve, obviously, but my imposter syndrome has actively made me a better professional. It's encouraged me to improve in my own abilities. We're going to close off with a bit of a strange source. One of the things I enjoy immensely about software development is, strangely enough, coding comments. I have a mild obsession with them, and I spend many hours like poring through our own code base or looking at source code online and looking at archives of comments that developers have written into their own code. It's a uniquely humane experience for me. I find this might sound like I'm sort of reveling in other people's suffering a little bit, but there's something so distinctly amazing about coming across a coder's comments and seeing the decline of their sanity as you work through the comments and seeing how they slowly lose their mind as they try and accomplish a job. That might seem a little bit cruel, but I promise you there is actually a point to this. I'm going to show a few examples, and we're going to see some of the difficulties that people suffer from in coding. Let's have a look at our first example over here. So this one was pulled. I found this on the internet, but apparently it's actually quite common in a lot of code bases. Dear maintainer, once you are done trying to optimize this routine and you've realized what a terrible mistake that was, please increment the following counter as a warning to the next guy. Total hours wasted here, 73. A good one. This next one actually comes from my own code base. Now, I've removed all of the names for the sake of anonymity, but this was a particularly amusing experience to me when I first encountered it. I was busy refactoring quite a messy piece of code and came across this. So the 21st of April, urgent. This needs to be removed ASAP. Just adding it so that the sanity testing and my own can pass. Update on the 25th. Let's be honest, this has almost no chance of being removed. The following comments I actually found from the source code of a video game I enjoyed in my childhood. I think it was called Simpsons Hit and Run. The source code got released to the internet, and out of curiosity, I started diving through it and looking at some of the comments. And these developers have a very unique sense of humor. The first one, this is a nasty hack. God, please forgive me. This is the easiest thing for me to do with just a few days left before beta release. I'm sure many of you have been in that position before where you've had to submit code that is truly, truly shocking. And the last one for this presentation, very simple, very elegant, but I feel it captures a lot of the essence of the difficulty that coders face in their code base. Quite simply, I'm sorry. Coming back to what I said earlier, this isn't just me reveling in the suffering of other developers. It's actually a reminder that people who are way more experienced than myself, who have way more experience and are professionals in this, have suffered just as I have. Those feelings of difficulty, those feelings of insecurity I have when I push through genuinely terrible code, the code upon which I'm working already has that in it. Those people have suffered through it just like I have. And it's a palpable reminder that not only have I come a long way, but that my imposter syndrome isn't really that justified because everyone is experiencing this. So if you find yourself feeling down in your abilities, just try and remember that you're actually not here by accident. You're here because of your accomplishments. You're here because you've worked hard, because you have hit some of that technical excellence. Always try and remind yourself that you are here, you're always improving, and if you give it a little bit of time and effort, you will succeed. Thank you very much.